I may be a young adult of the 1990s, but I never got into. I understood what he was and sort of the ecosystem that he lived in. But I was really more about things like Alex Bennett program on Live 105. Places that brought comedians on but weren't actually making points. And Alex could absolutely get a little bit shock jockey at times, but rarely. Usually it was his guests who did stuff that was semi-questionable. But Stern was always a presence in radio. And he meant more than radio, even when he was just radio. And in researching this, I found out that Howard Stern is a really interesting character. And when I talk about Don Imus, who is another fascinating character, the way I kind of look at it is if Stern is Woody Allen, Imus was Lenny Bruce. I think there's a really interesting sort of set of scenarios. And Howard Stern was born in 1954 in Queens. And he grew up mostly on Long Island. He's a Long Island boy. Just hearing him talk, you can tell. And he was one of those socially awkward, bullied, anxious guys who, if you apply the internet to, become incels. But it's interesting is that he was hyper aware of and role and how he could not quite subvert, but definitely latch onto things that would allow him to move forward and upward. And his dad was a radio engineer, and he absolutely despised him. There's a lot of stuff there that sort of needs to be unpacked. His books do a decent job of it. But it's absolutely real. And he was surrounded by the material culture of radio, microphones, wires, just things that represented radio. My kids will have that for history. It's a very different sort of thing. It's almost absorption by exposure. Now, in the early 70s, he started out at BU on WTBU. I think that was Tony Chinamo's channel. That might have been BUR, but I know Tony was there and actually knew Stern a little bit. And he didn't give... This is something that's interesting. At that point, there was very much I don't want to say edict, but it was more of a evolved form of voice that you have. It's sort of the authoritative announcer voice. This is WBUR, Boston. But he went away from that. And he was very much about an emotional delivery, an honest emotional. If he was annoyed by something, he expressed it like he was annoyed. If he wanted to celebrate something, he celebrated it. This was definitely a departure from what everyone else was doing. And that got him attention because when he graduated in 76, he sort of bumped around from station to station. He never had a problem getting a job. And he only worked at one station, well, two stations that I've ever listened to. WWWW in Detroit, which I remember listening to, fairly certain, the few times I would go to Detroit when I got to meet the Sheik. Love that guy. And WWDC in Washington, which I listened to. But he moved through them relatively, didn't really stick around too. But there was a pattern. Stern would get hired. He'd be a DJ. He'd pretty much ignore the advice to go and playlists, more or less, and would do his own thing. He would talk about how management was messing around with him. And when he would be treated as just another DJ, he'd go on air and say, I'm not just another DJ, and here's what they're trying to do to me. These weren't tantrums. They were expressions of real frustration and anger, not only for this position he finds himself in, but for the entire idea of what radio should be. He thought that radio should be a, for lack of a better word, personal documentary format. That the DJs were the ones who should be in charge of content, not management. And, by the 80s, he was really certain that traditional radio was a dishonest medium. He's not wrong. But I will also say that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, at this point, he wouldn't be considered a shock jock, or at least what we see him as today. He was something more akin to a trickster god, maybe? But at that point, by the early 80s, he had set what he thought the rest of his career could be. And that's when he went to WNBC. That was in 1982. And this is his first real major market platform. This is New York City. This is NBC Radio's flagship station. And it was a tightly managed ship. And immediately he did a couple of things. He talked about internal communications on air. He complained about him being censored. He referenced meetings and restrictions that he was given. It is a radio host fighting on the air against management. And this is sort of a personalized version because, if you look at other NBC products at the time, and their shows are products, you just have to go to TV and look at David Letterman. David Letterman is doing similar stuff as bits within his show, obviously exposing that he is a figure with a point of view, but instead he's doing more of the trickster god thing again. He is being less, I don't think any less sincere, but he's being less adversarial, whereas Stern is all about the adversary. And every time management came and clamped down, he responded by escalating. And this happened at the final straw in 1985. And he was fired, but they let him, this is the absolute mistake, they let him have broadcasts after the firing. And I've seen it described as a public autopsy of the relationship. It's an interesting way to do it, that he looked at what WNBC had done to him while he was, and his ratings were great. The thing is, Stern is radio verite, I think, in a very different way. He's presenting his experience to the listeners within a traditional format that they understand, except for he's saying things that he shouldn't be saying. So Stern ended up hired by K-Rock almost immediately. And K-Rock was a little bit looser, probably a lot looser in radio terms. And Stern brought something completely new. And this is really where the modern Howard Stern show comes from, because his staff members are no longer anonymous. It's no longer the disc jockey as the form of a group of people working to present something. It is now an eco. And he gives them names. He talks about them. He argues with them. Everyone from the main engineers and producers to the interns. And characters start to pop up from them. Mostly based on their real identities. But not entirely. The minute you are on a microphone, you are less yourself than you are what you present. And this is really an interesting point. It's not for this podcast, but there is a character in the UK known as Jimmy Savile, one of the most beloved performers in the history of British broadcasting, who also happened to be. And the arguments there are that he was absolutely unreal when he was presenting himself, and that the rest of it was him. But he always claimed, and I think rightfully, that what he was on air was who he was as a person. That both of these things exist. It is just the microphone amps up a decided part of that. And Stern has never gone in that direction, as far as anyone has ever said. Good. But the dichotomy within a lived reality is there and understandable. And this is also where he starts to bring more sexual content to his work. In the late 80s, his stuff is very frank, particularly when he interviews guests and callers, and it moves away from sort of the politeness of traditional call-in radio. And that gets him in trouble with everyone. And there are ongoing storylines. That's the other interesting thing. Callers will call in day after day. You'll hear about a relationship that is being founded by one of the staff members, and you have to follow that. By the time the 90s come around, Stern's show is nationally syndicated. We've also well and truly entered into the Bush administration. And that's where the FC and starts to find stations that air Stern for his content. And I believe he was the most fined individual in the history of broadcasting up to that point. Millions. Because of stations airing what they saw as indecent. But at the same time, Stern leans into it. He doesn't change the content that is getting him fined. Instead, he rolls the entire idea of the fine into his shtick. And it works. He positions himself as a free speech absolutist. And I don't buy that. I just don't. I think the problem is that he is saying things specifically to be provocative. That's not the same thing as being a free speech absolute. A free speech absolutist is saying, you can scream fire in a crowded theater, and you can call me a liar whether or not I lie. What he is an expansive free speech advocate. That he believes that topics shouldn't be off limit, but arenas still believes in satire and all these other things. But all topics are okay. No sounds are forbidden, to quote John Cage, and one of my favorite all-time. What really things change is in 1992, and Stern delivers I would almost go unhinged, but definitely mad monologue, accusing the music industry and radio executives of what we might call payola. And the tone, completely dead straight. It's no jokes. He is complaining about one of the basic ongoing tenets of how radio works. It makes him a truth teller. He knows what he's talking about, and he doesn't care what bridges he burns. That's powerful. I will go on record to say something strange. Payola is fine, honestly. It's no different than any other form of broadcasting. The only thing is it does empower those with money to get their ideas put forward. Show me an industry where that's not the truth. I do see problems, of course, with using that to shut down complicated speech. But within 10 years, this whole thing would have gone away anyhow because of the availability of things like YouTube, like net radio, where anyone could do anything, really, to get what they wanted to have heard out. But that's just me. By 1993, Stern is a massive national figure. And he releases a book, Private Parts, which is a massive bestseller. And he sort of establishes himself as this, not necessarily trendsetter, but as a obsessed, driven guy who had to persevere through all of these things to make it to where he is. It's a really well-written book. But he's also clearly writing myth, in a way. Not in that he's telling lies, but in that he is pointing out importance that can be taken and stripped of its context and held up within a spotlight. And that's interesting. It's a really good read. I really recommend it. Is it true? Yeah, for the most part. There are certainly things in there that are his point of view of events. But when is that not true? I think it is one of the very few biographies that is better approached as biography than as myth-making. But I think at the same time, a lot of the stuff he did has become mythic in and of itself. So in 94, he does the crazy thing. He runs for governor of New York. He is not the first controversial celebrity to do the whole I'm running for Congress, mayor, blah, blah, blah. Jello Biafra, of course, did it in San Francisco, one of his... But it is interesting in that he's running on the Libertarian ticket, which was a legitimate party, and he qualified for the ballot. And he centered himself as an anti-censorship, anti-government hypocrisy. I do not believe he would have done this if he thought he could. I don't. I don't think he was a serious candidate in the way that he thought he could serve. But I think it was one part publicity stunt and one part setting a flag in the ground. That I am serious about this. I mean this. And I am willing to stand for this publicly. Beyond just being a shock jock. Because at this point, he is full-on shock jock. Now, he published a second book, Miss America, which is not as good, but it's okay. It sells really well, too. But it really was there that he started to get sort of a polarizing view from people. And not just polarizing as it had been previously, where he was really separating those who believed that the content was inappropriate versus those who thought that the content was good and listenable and entertaining. Now there's this sort of weird gray area in which it's people who think the content is fine, the material is well delivered, but it's wrong to have it on the air, at least in the format they were going in, which is an interesting note. There are also people who are having problems with the general idea of how he is presenting minority groups, the disabled, women, and that's completely legit and did not start here, but was really driven home here. Now, what's interesting is that the film, Private Parts, comes out, and he played himself. It's interesting in that I think the version of Stern that shows up in the movie is a reflective Stern. I think in the 3 years since, there had been so much that had happened to him, so much of him giving himself, because he is an insanely hard worker, an insanely imaginative thinker, and he works really hard to make himself human in this. More so than in the book. But it's also clear that he's sort of trying to steer his legacy in one direction. Now, it's 1999, and we have a turning point, and that's a Columbine High School massacre. What happens in American media at that point is insane. We lose our minds. Not as much as after 9/11, but there is many things that they sort of go back to in Stern that they see as not necessarily inciting violence, but inspiring it. And this generation of kids, like Dylan Cleese, who would end up going to do violent things. You would be hard-pressed to find an early incel on the web, a pre-Elliot Rodgers type, who didn't love Stern. There is some legitimate backlash. And of course, Stern says, "This is not my problem. This is not the fault of me." But he's wrong. Not entirely. There is an aspect of his delivery and his belief in this universal, absolute free speech that encourages these types. And while he is very introspective on himself and his foibles, he doesn't examine himself as a cultural figure. Ever. For him, everything is personal. And even when he is doing things like the payola deal that are dealing with the wider culture, he's not dealing with his responsibility within that culture, because he says that he was never a part of that culture. And he wasn't, per se. Although, you could argue that by participating in the general culture of radio at all, he was. I don't know. There's a big question mark there as to why Stern didn't turn his gaze inward professionally and culturally as much as he did personally. And some advertisers start pulling out. Some stations start not using him. This is where we start to see the slow decline of the shock jock. Although I do kind of say it's more of a watering down. Because now you're seeing disc jockeys around the country who are using diluted versions of Stern for themselves. We come to 2006, and Stern becomes the figure to make the move off of traditional radio and onto Sirius satellite radio. This has two really important things. One, he is completely off of FCC regulation. But two, and really important, is that it legitimizes non-radio swish audio presentation. He's the reason a lot of people bought Sirius. And as we've seen Sirius XM and Sirius satellite radio and all of it move forward, it's largely because Stern set. But the thing is, he also changes. Because he's on Sirius, it doesn't matter about the language. It doesn't matter about the content, somewhat. But by 2007, without having to worry about ratings, his interviews become longer. The topics become different. He deals with things like trauma, addiction, failure. All of this with significant figures. In a way, in 2007, 2008, he's doing interviews that are significant journalism, informed by someone who very much often looks inside himself to draw out the stuff that he was presenting in private part from others. And he's good at it. In a way, it is confessional. He's one of the best interviewers in American media. I will definitely argue. But what's interesting is that by the time you get to the 2010s, he's sort of looking at his role. And he does look at misogyny. He does look at his ideas of race. He does look at his use of character. Once he does that, things start to change. Now, what's really interesting is that he has cultural relevance today. But I would say today's Howard Stern show is not trashy like it was in the 2000s, very early. A lot of podcasting would be informed by Stern's format. You wouldn't have Joe Rogan without Howard Stern. Oh, that means we should go back in time and stop Stern. I'm sorry. Or maybe just give him another show after news radio ends. But he's very much limited his sort of presence now, largely because we've caught up to him. I'm glad to see that he is finally looking back at his and saying there were issues. Some of them were me, some of them were culturally, some of them were the times. Which is fine and great. He should have done it 20 years before. But better late than never, right? Next time, Trashy's going to look at something a little bit different. Because we've looked at books, we've looked at radio, we've looked at television, we've looked at movies. But we haven't looked at an area that I consider to be one of the most fascinating. And that is actually VHS tapes. That's right, we're looking at Girls Gone Wild. So I hope you'll stay tuned. Because if you love it and hate yourself for that, it's probably trashy. Thanks for listening.